fun.
Hello and welcome to the regular meeting of the Planning Commission on Tuesday, February 15th, 2022. This meeting is called to order. I'll request staff to call the roll for commissioners who are present and not.
Yes, Commissioner Harris.
Here.
Commissioner Haveman. Absent. Commissioner Mercado. Absent. Commissioner Samudzi.
Here.
Vice Chair Saudi.
Here.
And Chair Previtali.
Here. Okay, great. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the order of the agenda. Are there any changes to the order of the agenda? Okay, hearing none. Next, we'll move on to the meeting procedures. Staff will relay instructions on how to participate in tonight's virtual meeting.
Yes, thank you, Chair Previtali. At this time, well, mostly commissioners, but I'd like to ask everyone other than the commissioners to turn off their cameras till it's your turn to present. If you are participating on the web and wish to provide public comment, when the chair opens the public comment period, please use the raise the hand icon at the bottom of the screen. If you are participating by telephone tonight and wish to provide comments, please press *9 when the chair opens the public comment period to raise your hand. Once you hear a notification that the host is inviting you to speak, please press *6 to unmute yourself. You will have 3 minutes to speak. All public correspondence received by noon today has been forwarded to the Planning Commission, and closed captioning is available for this meeting, and the link is on YouTube.
Great, thanks, Leslie. All right, let me now describe meeting procedures as our one item is an update. We will begin with a staff report. Members of the public will then be invited to speak. People on the conference call can speak when they receive the notification they have been asked to unmute themselves. Based on the number of participants here tonight, the public will have 3 minutes to speak as discussed. We will close the public hearing and bring the matter back to the commission for any further comments or discussion after the public comment period. And now for urgent communications. Does anyone have an urgent communication on a topic not on the agenda? Please go ahead and address the commission at this time.
And I will let you know that we have no attendees. So unless there is a member of the board, the commission wishing to speak, I think we can move to the next item.
Leslie, there's nobody on YouTube Live today?
They may be, but we don't accept comments through YouTube, so they would have to phone in.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. No urgent communications. All right, we'll now move on to the consent calendar. We have one item on the consent calendar, the minutes from the January 25th, 2022 San Rafael Planning Commission meeting. Leslie?
Yes, again, since we have no members of the public here in attendance, I don't think anyone wishes to speak on this item from the public.
Okay, great. I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Commissioner Samudzi, so moved.
Do I have a second?
I second that motion.
Okay.
I'm sorry, who seconded?
Commissioner Harris.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Is there any discussion? Probably not. Okay. Leslie, could you do a roll call?
Yes, Commissioner Harris.
Yes.
Commissioner Haven. is absent.
Absent.
Commissioner Mercado is absent. Commissioner Samuzzi,
Yes.
Vice Chair Saudi,
Yes.
and Chair Previtali.
Yes. Okay, great. Thanks, Leslie. Okay, now we'll move on to tonight's action item. And we have one action item. It is the progress report on the San Rafael 2023 to 2031 housing element update. And with that, may I request the staff report?
Yes, and I'd like to, as you know, Community Development Director Ali Judici is here, and I think the main presenter will be Barry Miller, who is our star contract planner, who you know from such things as the general plan update and the downtown precise plan. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Barry.
My greatest hits, right?
Exactly.
I did want to ask Community Development Director Judici, did you have any comments before I jump in? I do have a PowerPoint presentation.
I do not. Barry, I'll
Okay.
go ahead and let you take over.
Great.
You have been doing a great job, and I appreciate you taking this on. So.
Okay, wonderful. Let me just confirm everyone can see my screen, and I know you can hear me. So we are going to be doing a progress report for you to let you know where we are with the housing element update. It's a little bit of a smorgasbord of a presentation in that we've combined some of both the community process that we've done so far with some of the data that we've collected so far and some of the substantive tasks on the element. We do have a few discussion questions at the end, which we invite you to think about. And for those commissioners who aren't here, perhaps some will join us in progress or will watch this afterwards. We do welcome your input as well. But this is the housing element update that we're discussing this evening, which is part of the San Rafael General Plan. It is a statement of our goals, policies, objectives, financial resources, and programs that deal with all things housing. So we're talking about housing production, housing preservation, and particularly housing that is affordable and that serves special needs populations in the city. So a quick overview. I think some of you have seen this slide in other presentations. This is one of the mandatory elements of our general plan. The Commission participated in numerous public hearings for the other elements of the general plan in 2020 and 2021. That was adopted in August 2021 by the City Council, but we didn't do the housing element at that time because this is the one part of the general plan that is updated based on a state schedule that's legislatively adopted. The document actually consists of two parts. There's a technical report, which is about 200 pages long, that includes data that's mandated by the state that talks about demographics and housing in the community. And then there's a policy and program document, which is much shorter and more in line with what the other elements of the general plan look like. The contents of the housing element are very prescriptive. So whereas we have a lot of flexibility with the other elements of the plan, this part of the plan, we have to follow statutory requirements. We can be a little creative, but at the end of the day, the state of California has a team of reviewers that goes through this element with a fine-tooth comb and makes sure that we have done all of the statutory requirements and in their preference of order. So the other unique aspects of the housing element, it covers an 8-year planning period. And we are just exiting the 5th cycle of the housing element. This is a process that's been underway for a number of 8-year cycles. The 5th cycle went from January 2015 to January 2023. So we've got a little less than a year left on that. The 6th cycle, which is what we're preparing now, governs January 2023 to 2031. So this will be the housing policy and program document for the next 8 years when it is adopted in January 2023. The other point about this is it's subject to certification. It's the only part of the general plan that we're required to submit to a state agency. They review it and certify it. If they find us out of compliance, it can lead to the loss of eligibility for funds. It's also, there's an increased risk of litigation and actually fines and penalties now for cities that are out of compliance. So it is in the best interest of all cities to go through this process and come out with a compliant element at the end. This slide shows you the contents of the housing element. Those colored boxes across the center of the slide correspond to the chapters of the technical report. We do an evaluation of the current housing element. How well are we doing implementing our policies and programs? The needs assessment, we'll talk a little bit about that in this presentation. We've just completed the preliminary needs assessment, which is really the data-driven part of the housing element that looks at demographics and housing market trends and so on. The constraints analysis looks at the obstacles to building and preserving housing in the community. Again, specifically affordable housing, but really, this touches all types of housing. And when we talk about constraints, we're referring to things like our zoning regulations, our development standards, our fees, our processing requirements, but also factors like market conditions, the cost of materials, the lack of infrastructure, and so on. Housing resources both looks at our financial resources, but primarily at our land resources. In other words, where in San Rafael can housing be built? Where does our zoning permit housing, particularly multifamily housing, because we're looking not only for sites to build homes, but more specifically for sites where affordable housing may be feasible. And then affirmatively furthering fair housing is a new requirement. We had not had to do that in the previous 5 cycles. It's always been kind of philosophically part of the housing element, but now it's statutorily part of the housing element. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a later slide, but it's really how do we ensure equitable outcomes and fair housing and avoid and end discrimination in our community in housing. So all of the technical work goes into a set of goals, objectives, policies, and actions. The housing element is underpinned by the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and many of you know the acronym RHNA. This is not a new requirement. You've been hearing about it more in the news because it's a much bigger number than it used to be, but this is the number of units that the state of California basically assigns to each region in California, and it determines that that's the number of units that region needs to produce in the next 8 years in order to balance supply and demand and meet housing needs. So there is this top-down process where the state essentially assigns a number to each council of governments. We are in the ABAG region, Association of Bay Area Governments, which is 9 counties, and then ABAG in our case, allocates those units to the individual local governments through a process that usually takes about a year and engages multiple jurisdictions, elected officials, advocates, stakeholders, staff, et cetera, from across the region. And then once the local governments are given their assignments, then they need to update their housing elements and show that they can accommodate what's called their fair share of the regional need. So the red number you see on the screen, 441,176 housing units, is the total number of units that the state determined the Bay Area needed to produce in order to, again, to meet the regional needs. And that's a much higher number than we've seen really ever, but particularly relative to the 5th cycle, which was about 187,000 units. And this is part of the reason why the number is so high. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but the important thing to note here is that this shows the RHNA for cycle 3, cycle 4, and cycle 5, the number of permits that were issued for cycle 3, 4, and 5, and the percentage of the regional need that was met through actual construction. What I want everyone to note here is that pretty much everybody in the region built their fair share of above moderate income housing, but almost nobody in the region built their fair share of very low and low income housing for a variety of reasons, primarily funding and just the cost and logistics of building low and very low income housing relative to the resources available. But part of the unmet need that was not met in these prior cycles has been carried forward into the current cycle, which is why our number is so big. This is another important data point to help frame where we are today. And what this is basically showing, those blue bars indicate the number of jobs that were added in the 9-county Bay Area during the 10-year period from 2010 to end of 2019. And those orange bars are the number of homes that were built in each county in the Bay Area during that same period. And the imbalance was 9-1 across the region. In Marin County, there were 23,200 jobs added over the decade and only 1,300 housing units added over the decade, which is a ratio of 18-1. So 18 jobs added for every home, every house permitted. And this really pushed that imbalance between supply and demand to again, levels that we haven't really seen before, creating the run-up in prices that we've been experiencing for the last few years. So the bottom line for San Rafael is that our fair share assignment, that our portion of the 441,000 units that have been assigned to the region is a little less than 1% of that regional total, or about 3,220 units. And one thing I want to point out is this does not mean that the city of San Rafael needs to go out tomorrow and begin building 3,000 units of housing. What this does mean is that we need to demonstrate that we have the capacity in our community based on our zoning and infrastructure and other things to accommodate this number of units. And if we don't, we are expected to take actions in the coming years to make sure that we can accommodate this number. And that's really what it takes to be certified by the state. So the way the units were allocated was based on the size of the community, the number of jobs in the community, the access to transit, but then a new factor that really hadn't been taken into consideration before, which is high resource areas or high opportunity areas. So if you were a more affluent community with good schools and good services and higher incomes, your RHNA number was higher relative to what other communities may have seen in their RHNA number for the current cycle. So there was kind of an equity outcome incorporated into the methodology really for the first time, at least at this level. Some of you may have seen the slide before. I don't think I've included it in previous presentations to the Planning Commission, but this is part of our community workshop presentation, which shows that it's not just San Rafael. Every community in Marin County saw large increases. In fact, on a percentage basis, our percentage increase was lower than most of the communities, even though our sheer number was higher. But you can see places like Mill Valley and Corte Madera and Larkspur and San Anselmo are looking at increases in the range of 600% over what they saw in the last housing element cycle. Now, the number that we have, that 3,220 units, it's not just a lump sum. It's actually broken down into these 4 income categories: very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. And for comparison, I've included at the top of the slide, right where my cursor is, the pie chart for the 2015 to 23 element that we're in right now. Our RHNA for the last cycle was only 1,007 units, which was actually a decrease from the cycle before that. 388 of those units were low and very low. For the current cycle, 1,349 units are low and very low. So the share of our assignment that is geared more toward the lower end of the income scale has increased. It was 39% here, it's higher now. So again, just as a benchmark, the income thresholds, so you have a sense of what above moderate and very low and all these things mean. For a family of 4 in Marin County, a low-income household would be earning between $91,000 and $146,000 a year. I think this is a really important data point because we say low-income housing, and folks often think we're talking about people who are, not working or maybe earning $25,000 a year, or and of course we are in some part, but that's actually extremely low income. Much of our low income and very low income population is our workforce and folks who are working in jobs that are essential to our community. You could argue the same is true of extremely low income, but this is a huge segment of our population that we're talking about here that cannot find housing in the community today. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and walk through some of what we've done so far. The first task is an evaluation of the current housing element. And this is one page out of that. That's about a 30-page document. And what this does is it goes through every goal, policy, and program in the current housing element and provides an assessment of how we're doing and whether we think the policy or program needs to be edited or carried forward or revised. In most cases, we're recommending revisions. You can see that here. We've also invited our housing element working group, which I'll talk about that in a later slide, to help us with their thoughts on evaluating the current housing element. In fact, this document is up on our website, and anyone in the community is invited and welcome to share their thoughts and comments on what's working and what's not working in the existing housing element. But this really provides the first step toward revisions. We have in the current housing element 2 goals. You can see them on the slide here. One of the first things that our working group, our housing element working group, discussed was whether these were adequate goals. I think the general consensus is that they're good goals, but they're not enough. We don't have enough breadth in these goals, and there are additional topics and points that need to be covered by our goal statements. And I should mention that the goals are kind of the top of the pyramid of our planning documents. Under each of these goals are numerous policies and programs. So these are really the headings of the policies that are in the existing housing element. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these or read all of these. It is really meant to give you a sense of the contents of our current housing element. So for each of the 19 topics you see listed here, there's a policy statement and then a series of programs that talks about the issues that are addressed in each case. We think there are a couple of topics that are missing here that we will be adding in the housing element update. There are also some new state laws that affect what we can include or what we must include here. And we're looking for input from you as commissioners and from City Council and from other people in the community about what we need to cover in our housing element. A working group, I mentioned, we did come to the commission last fall with a request for the commission to appoint a member to our housing element working group. Chair Previtali is serving on that group along with 12 other community members. And we've had 2 meetings of that group so far, and we have a 3rd meeting coming up on Thursday. The last working group was really focused on the questions that you see here. What's working, what's not working, what would you like to add, and how can we better structure our goals to meet our housing needs? We had a good discussion around these topics. And again, this is an ongoing, continuous process, so we're looking for additional feedback on those questions. I am going to shift for a couple of minutes into data wonky territory here, so bear with me as I recite. I won't be reading this straight off the screen, but I do want to point out some statistical information and data about the city that reveals a lot about the housing needs in the community. I mentioned that we did a housing needs assessment as part of this process. We're going to go over some highlights. Starting with the fact that San Rafael was actually one of the fastest growing cities in Marin County, despite adding very little housing during the 2010s. The city added 3,500 people and represented 36% of the growth of Marin County during that time period. Importantly, we added 3,500 people, but only about 150 housing units net during this time period. So that growth didn't happen because we were building a lot of housing. It happened because we have a lower vacancy rate and we have more people per household now than we did then. Some really interesting demographic trends, and I should also add that some of this is based on the 2020 census. We were fortunate that this process is timed to coincide with the release of the new decennial census data, Some of this just came out 2 or 3 months ago, and some of it is yet to come out. But we can tell you that the number of school-age children in San Rafael increased by 1,900 people. The number of residents over 65 increased by 2,200 people. And every other age cohort between 2010 and 2020 actually declined. And the biggest decline was the young adult population. There are 1,800 fewer persons 25 to 44 in San Rafael now than there were 10 years ago, despite the fact that the city added 3,500 people. And I think the housing cost in the city is part of the reason that we've seen that decline, because young adults are earning less, they're earlier in their careers, they're forming families, they can't afford to live in the city. The non-Hispanic white population in San Rafael declined from 70% to 54% of the total, again, just in that 10-year period, and the Hispanic population grew from 30 to 34%. I need to point out that that decline is partially due to the way the census counted residents and changes in definitions. So a much larger percentage of the population indicated that they were multiracial or that they were other in the new census. Many of the Latino residents in San Rafael who had reported that their ethnicity was white in the 2010 census reported that their ethnicity was other or Native American in the 2020 census. So some of this is due to definitions, but it is, I think, still significant that the non-Hispanic white population is now just a little over half of the city. And half of the city's children, in other words, half of the children between 5 and 18 in San Rafael are bilingual, speaking both a foreign language and English at home. 85% of those kids are speaking Spanish as their second language, but there's 15% that are speaking other languages in their homes, including Chinese and Vietnamese and other languages that besides Spanish. Okay, so some household highlights. 50% of the households in San Rafael are homeowners and 50% are renters. It is literally almost an even split. The difference is like 16 households between owners and renters. And that percentage of renters has been going up. So again, cost of housing is making it more difficult for people to become homeowners in the city. The percentage of renters has gone from 46% in 2000 to 48% in 2010, and it's now at 50. 1 in 3 San Rafael households is a single person living alone. I think that's an important data point also. We have a lot of single family homes that are occupied by one person. In many cases, they're older adults. 29% of the city's households have children under 18 that are living at home. And 14% of all of our homeowners and 29% of all of our renters are spending more than 50% of their incomes on their housing costs. And that figure is higher among Latino households, where 39% of all Latino households in the city are spending more than half of their incomes on housing. We use 30% as the benchmark, but there are now, we still use 30%, but 50% is considered to be severe overpayment. And I think it's important to note that nearly a third of the renters in the city of San Rafael are spending more than 50% of their income on their housing costs. We've also seen an increase in overcrowding from 6.1% to 10.9% between 2010 and 2020. That entire increase from 6.1 to 10.9 is associated with our rental units. The number of overcrowded owner-occupied homes actually went down during the decade, and the number of owner-occupied rental homes went up overcrowded rental homes went up fairly significantly during that time. A couple of slides on our economy. Sorry if this is sounding like San Rafael trivia contest, but I've got, I think, 2 more of these slides and then some final slides on the tasks that are underway. So San Rafael is a regional job center. I think this is something we all know. 35% of all of the jobs in Marin County were located in San Rafael in 2019 before COVID. But only 27% of those jobs were filled by San Rafael residents. So the city is a employment center with a large number of folks commuting in from elsewhere, 30% commuting in from elsewhere in Marin, and 43% that are commuting in from other counties, primarily North Bay counties like Sonoma and East Bay, Alameda, Contra Costa. Many jobs in the city don't provide enough income to rent an apartment in the city. If you were a household earning $63,000, you half of your income on your rent in order to meet in the city. And we know that there are in the city that are not earning $63,000 a year. 47% of San Rafael's household are considered to be lower income, and that definition is different depending on what county you're in. So each county has a median income, and the definition of low, moderate, very low, et cetera, is scaled to each county. We have more than 4,000 households in the city that are earning less than 30% of the countywide median income, who are considered extremely low income. That's a large percentage of the population. A couple of data points about our special needs population. Older adults, these are people over 65, and they are the fastest growing age cohort in the city. Half of the city's older adult households are low or very low income, and 11% of the owner-occupied homes in San Rafael are persons over 75 living alone. So one-person households with a householder over 75 represent 11% of the owner-occupied homes. A little over 8% of San Rafael's residents have one or more disabilities. More than 500 residents with developmental disabilities. These are things like autism. 12.6% of the city's renter households are classified as large households by the US Census, and we are obligated under housing element law to evaluate the needs of large households. In this case, there are many larger households living in overcrowded conditions. And then our unhoused population, and I believe that the point in time survey that would have happened in 2021 is going to happen very soon for Marin County. But between 2015 and 2019, there was a decline in the number of unhoused residents in San Rafael from 349 to 255. We will see shortly what the updated count is. Would have happened in 2021, but for the pandemic. So that is scheduled very soon. I think this is the last of the data of the data slides. And again, some data about the housing stock. 56% of the homes in San Rafael are single family homes. That leaves about 42% that are multifamily and 2% that are mobile homes. And 43% of all the homes in San Rafael were built in the 1950s and 1960s. So that was really the boom time in terms of construction in the city. And but about 60% of our homes now are more than 50 years old. In 2020, the city had a little over 1,000 vacant units, 4.7%. That's a smaller number of vacant units, a lower vacancy rate than the city had in 2010. In 2010, we were in an economic slump and the vacancy rate was considerably higher. 54% of the city's housing units have 2 bedrooms or fewer. I think that's also kind of an interesting statistic that that is the median number of bedrooms in San Rafael's homes, 2 bedrooms, a lot of smaller apartments in the city. And then, of course, the statistic that we have talked about before, which is that the median value of a home in San Rafael increased by 123% in that 10-year period between 2011 and 2021, from $615,000 to $1,370,000, and median rents increased by about 50% over that same time period. So not as steep, but the increase is significant. And when you've got a population that's more economically vulnerable and experiences hardship as rents go up, that increase is very significant. So we're moving now to some, but I should clarify that the tasks that the information you've just seen is primarily from tasks that have been completed as part of the housing element update. We're moving now into some of the second phase tasks, which is identifying our housing sites and evaluating our housing constraints, and that will help us evaluate or develop our policies and programs. So we need to, again, identify sites for 3,220 units. That would include any project that is in the development pipeline. These are projects that have been approved but not yet constructed. Even some of the projects that are conceptual that haven't been approved yet that we feel have a strong likelihood of being approved. Vacant sites where housing is permitted. There actually aren't very many of those in San Rafael. Primarily, we're talking about underutilized commercial sites, and these could be parking lots, they could be vacant buildings, they could be sites that are just really not developed to what's permitted by zoning or with land values that are very high relative to the improvement values. There are a whole series of metrics that the state gives us for what is underutilized. We also have institutional uses in surplus public land. Again, not a lot, but there is some. We have accessory dwelling units that we can count toward our RENA based on our past production trends. We can say, well, we produced 25 ADUs during 2019, 2020, 2021. Therefore, we think we're going to continue to produce that quantity in the next 8 years, and we can count those toward our total. At this point, we don't anticipate a lot of rezoning in the city, given that we've just completed the general plan, but there may be some tweaks to the existing zoning ordinance and regulations to make it easier to build housing in the city. This could include changes to our height and density and some of our development standards. Less likely that we will allow housing where it's not allowed today, but that is on the table for discussion. It's important also to point out that the state has changed the rules for what constitutes an adequate housing site, and also that we must provide a buffer. So we can't simply say we've identified enough sites for 3,220 units, end of day, period, we're done. We actually have to provide more than that number in case some of those sites become unavailable during the planning period. So if we've identified a site that is, say, a commercially zoned site for housing, but someone comes along and wants to put retail there, we lose that site, and then we have to have another site available to make up for it. So there's a buffer, roughly 20% on top of the RENA that we need to include in our site inventory. We also have to demonstrate that non-vacant sites are realistic housing sites, that if we say an office building is a housing site, the state will ask us to explain why we think that and what data supports that. The same if a site is less than 1/2 an acre or larger than 10 acres. And again, these are pegged to data that the state maintains about where most affordable housing is constructed, generally on sites of between 1/2 an acre and 10 acres. If we carry sites over from one housing element to the next, in other words, if we just go back to the last housing element and say, well, we counted that site and it didn't get built on, let's just carry it forward. We can do that, but we have to provide for streamlined approvals for projects on those sites if they meet certain criteria set by the state. And we need to identify which of our sites are suitable for low and very low income. I mentioned the general plan update and the downtown precise plan. We did, through that process, create sufficient capacity for more than 4,000 housing units. About half of those are in downtown San Rafael. There's current proposals for more than 1,000 units at Northgate. There are school properties where we know that there is some potential and opportunity for housing in the future. We have vacant or partially vacant office buildings and retail and commercial buildings that allow housing. And again, some of these sites were counted before, but we will be putting the zoning in place to allow us to count them again. Last couple of slides here. Again, a new state law requires that the housing element affirmatively further fair housing. And this is really carrying portions of the Federal Fair Housing Act into our local housing element. What we do through this process is we show that we're not only promoting fair housing, but we're also proactively improving opportunities for those living in areas of poverty to move where they choose in the city and to create opportunities more evenly and equally across the community. And this is both a regional and a local objective. I think it's important to note that AFFH is multidimensional. It's not, again, it's not just about saying that we're going to enforce fair housing laws. There's a lot of data that needs to be collected as part of this. The AFFH analysis for communities that I've seen is about 75 pages of data and maps. It's very detailed. And then we have to answer these questions. How do we overcome past patterns of inequity and segregation in our community? And we have those patterns here in San Rafael. How do we avoid displacement? So we're reinvesting in our housing stock and we're encouraging construction. How do we do that without displacing particularly lower income renters? How do we reduce housing barriers throughout the entire community for lower income and special needs households? And then there is the kind of more traditional awareness and enforcement of fair housing laws. We also have to show that we're distributing our housing sites equitably across the city. So we can't lump all 4,000 of our housing units in one part of San Rafael. We actually need to demonstrate that our housing opportunities are geographically distributed. And then the last bullet here is another really important part of AFFH, and that's about our process. And that is that we can't just have the usual suspects at the table when we have these conversations about housing. We need to engage the entire community in this conversation, including folks who have not participated in our processes before, folks who don't speak English, who just don't have access to the same resources. Just what can we do to make sure that our process is inclusive and equitable? So I'm going to just quickly go over the schedule. We're in this January to May period right now, developing our policies and programs, working on our site inventory. Most of the work in the fourth quarter of 2021 was focused on data collection and analysis and beginning to roll out our engagement strategy. We do have to have a draft housing element ready by this summer, even though the deadline is January 2023. That is the deadline for adopting the housing element. We have to provide a draft to the state before we adopt, and we provide that draft to them. They review it and give us comments, and then we revise it based on their comments. And only then do we have the formal planning commission and council hearings to adopt the element. And that is at the end of 22 and beginning of 2023. We have an outreach and education and engagement process that's underway, including the project website. We had a community workshop in November. More are planned. I mentioned the working group earlier. That's a 13-member group. There's a housing survey in the works. There's outreach to various community groups and civic groups that's underway. We're working with Y-Plan and Youth and Arts on a youth engagement initiative. Our stakeholder engagement is really reaching out to housing advocates, those who develop housing, those who provide supportive services. We have council and commission meetings like this one, and then we are launching an outreach initiative, which is really already underway to lower income and non-English speaking residents in the community. Last couple of slides, just to point out that we do have to have a compliant housing element when we're done with this. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are penalties and fines for communities that don't meet that are found to be non-compliant. And so I had to throw this in, lessons learned from the Southland. The Southern California communities had to submit their housing elements on a different cycle. Theirs were due October 15th, 2021. Ours are due January 2023. So they passed their deadline already. I wanted to point out here, this is the Southern California Association of Governments. This is last week. Only two cities out of 197 are in compliance 4 months after the deadline. This scares me a lot. And I mean, the good news is I don't think they're going to come down with compliance actions against all of the other cities. But what this is saying is that the state is taking this very seriously and is likely to provide some significant comments on our element and on all of the elements. And so it's not as easy as it used to be to get a compliant housing element. So we need to be prepared when we receive our comments from HCD that the road to getting compliance is going to be a little bit bumpy and require a lot of input from this commission and from the council and from others in the community. So this is the final slide, and just some thoughts for the commission. I want to leave you with questions that you may have about the process and the content, thoughts that you may have about what policies and programs are working or not working, thoughts about housing needs and sites, and then we are providing an opportunity for public comment. I hope when I end my share, I will see that we have some public, one person, okay. But that does conclude the presentation, and thank you, commissioners, for bearing with me through a lot of information.
Thank you. That was a really great information. A lot to think about.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Barry. Okay, now is the time for the commission to ask any questions of staff. Do you have any questions?
I have a lot of random questions that I wrote down during the slide period. So there were a lot of numbers that were given for 2020. And I was wondering if those were post-COVID or pre-COVID, like the overcrowding numbers that we saw seemed really low. And I have a feeling after COVID, where some of the most vulnerable households were hit pretty hard, that overcrowding was increased substantially.
The overcrowding number specifically was from the American Community Survey data from 2019. So it's pre-COVID. The only data that's really post-COVID in here is the actual census itself was taken on April 1st, 2020, which is literally 13 days after the after the lockdown.
Hard to measure. Yeah, it's hard to measure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then how do you accurately count 5+ households? Because I would imagine it's really hard to get real data on those numbers when you have like either people are not like they have fear of reporting actual counts, or I mean, how is that data being taken?
I think there's a chronic undercount associated with undocumented populations in both the community and the country. And the data that is presented in this report is not based on 100% sample. It's only, in other words, it's not based on the 2020 census, it's based on sample data extrapolated to the whole population. So there's a margin of error with a lot of those numbers.
Yeah, because I think that, you know, there are areas of San Rafael that are considered, you know, areas of lower income, but those units are not, the rent is not very low. It's still, you know, it could be high. So I'm thinking that those units are being rented by several families or more than 5 people. And then, you know, what is our current estimate of unhoused?
So the last number that is official is the 250, I'm forgetting the actual numbers, like in the 250s, but that's from January 2019. And I'm pretty sure the point in time survey that was supposed to happen last January is scheduled for this week.
Okay,
for
yeah,
next
so we're
week.
supposed to go out and like count people, right?
Yeah, it's based on an actual count that's done in the field.
Okay. And do we have an idea? Because I think there's been a lot of work with the resource center, or I forget what it's called, but under the freeway where it just seems like we're working to really, you know, not eliminate the problem, but at least temper it. So I feel like San Rafael, at least our city, has a better picture of what our unhoused population is.
Yeah, I can just speak to that a little bit. Unfortunately, we don't have Mark Sabin here to provide a better, understanding of what everything that's happening. But we're making an effort. We have at least, we have one home key site that has been identified that is, opportunity for providing housing. We also have 190 Mill Street that is currently under construction. That's intended to provide emergency shelter beds, as well as 32 units for individuals. We have the Vivalon senior housing development that is intended for 67 seniors. Some of that housing will be intended to house currently homeless seniors. So there's definitely a great effort that's being made. In addition to that, we're focused on providing wraparound services. That's mean that we're not just trying to identify housing opportunities, but also finding opportunities for providing the resources that our homeless population is needing. So there's definitely a lot that, and I see Alexis that is joining. I don't know if Alexis, you want to add. Alexis has been supporting the homeless program as well. So Alexis, did you have something?
I was just going to mention, good evening, everyone. As Barry said, we don't have the 2021 point in time count, but what was done instead in April of 2021 was a vehicle count. And so there was a 91% countywide increase from 2019 to 2021 in the number of people living in vehicles, including 119% increase in San Rafael specifically. So just to provide a little bit more context on some of the numbers that we do have.
Yeah, it seems like that really hints towards what I think we all intuitively know, but not hard numbers, right? And then one of my questions was, looking at the growth of the school age population and then identifying sites for potential housing and having those be school sites. Like, I know we've talked about this before, but how are we addressing the need for, schooling more children, but also providing housing? Because it seems like, those two slides kind of are looking at it from a different angle.
Yeah, we're going to be meeting with the school district as part of this process to talk through their plans and because they have a facilities master plan and they have their own demographic forecasts. And again, we're providing for a certain number of units, but we're not necessarily saying we're forecasting that all those units to be built in the next 8 years and that's our projection for growth. That's almost, in fact, if you think about our general plan is for 2040, and we provided that quantity of land and sites for 20 years. And what we're being asked to do in our housing element is show that we can get there in 8 years. We don't actually know if that quantity of development is going to happen. But the EIR for the general plan looked at the forecasted number of students going out to 2040. And at this point, I don't think we're talking about taking any functioning schools and converting them into housing sites. The couple of sites that have been identified are, I don't know if they're there's probably a technical definition of surplus land, but they're lands that are owned by the school district that have been identified before as having the potential for housing. They're mostly undeveloped areas.
Got it. Yeah, and then my last question is, how do we translate our needs and our target areas with actual building? You know, how do we get developers or investors or whomever to start? How do we action the plan that you've put forth?
It's always been the challenge. You know, the city council, as you know, over the past few years has done some work around trying to remove barriers. And because one of the things that we heard from developers is that, you know, once you get through the entitlement process, there's that additional hurdle to cross. And so trying to find the right things to target, the right policies to target, and you know, hopefully inspiring development and inspiring developers to kind of, you know, to take development to that next step. One of the things that we did is, you know, make adjustments to the affordable housing requirement. You know, we continue to just be better and more in terms of our processes. We've been trying to be more streamlined. And yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we're doing and are more aware of with community development is just, you know, keep it in mind that we're partners in this, and it's going to take all of us to really try to find a solution and attempt to see it through to development. So, but there's definitely work to do. And yeah, hopefully this housing element. So sorry, Barry, go ahead.
That's okay. No, that's the right answer. And I would also add that, you know, money is the answer too. That it's not the city. I mean, it's money from the state, it's money from the federal government, it's money from the private sector. But that's the biggest obstacle right now. I think we can do what we can do. We're a piece of the solution, but we can't be 100% of the solution. It's partnerships and finding additional funding sources and so forth.
Yeah, I just wonder what the impact is of collecting all the fees that we do for opting out of low-income units, and how that translates to like if that money is sitting there and it's not being utilized, like what's the opportunity cost that we like currently have, right? Because I'm, you know, I don't know the numbers, but I know project after project we see the, you know, the pay to go forward, right?
Yeah.
Makes sense. Any more questions? I've got a few. Okay, I'll go ahead and ask mine. And actually, it's so interesting. My questions were on the exact same 3 topics that Commissioner Saudi's questions were on. So first, around homelessness, I understand that research suggests that when housing prices and rental costs go up, we see an increase in the homeless population, which makes sense. And I think it's mostly because of evictions. So I was wondering if we're tracking evictions and if that's, you know, indeed a cause of homelessness in our community. And part of the question is also, you know, could we hear just a brief overview of what sort of renter protections we have now in our community?
Yeah, I don't know if staff, if Ali or you and Jake or Alexis want to address that question on evictions and renter protection.
Yeah, I can start, and I'll ask Jacob and Alexis if they want to join in with any additional. We have been working on, you know, as part of our entire housing evaluation on housing, we've been working on adopting renter protections. One of the things that we did in the past year and prior to, I think probably as COVID was hitting, is just making sure that we were adopting the right eviction protections. And we did have a rent cap that was also adopted and went through December 31st. There's also the ongoing cap on percentage of rental increases that exist that landlords need to comply with. And we have heard that, renter protections are, one of the primary issues that some of our lower income families are worried about. That's one of their primary concerns. So it's something that we'll continue to monitor. And Jacob, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add, or Alexis that you want to add to that. But yeah, something that we will look into as part of this housing element.
Yeah, I'll, Jacob Noonan, housing manager. I'll just add that there is state law in place, and there is language in our code around tenant protections, and we are working on pushing information out into the community. As one of the important things about renter protections is making sure that people know their rights and are able to achieve their rights, so that they know who to call and where to go when they are when there's questions or issues around eviction or rent increases or other aspects that are covered under those rent protections.
Okay, great, thank you. My next question was also around the school districts, actually. And this question is just, I think this came up in the last meeting with Northgate, when we were talking about Northgate. Yeah, I was wondering if we could just confirm that there is going to be an alignment between the number of new units, the number of new children, and the fees or the taxes that are going to be generated by that new population for the schools. Would someone be prepared to talk about sort of like the interplay between the housing element and the school district's revenue?
I don't know that we're prepared to talk about that tonight, but that's the kind of topic that if you want more information, we can research that and bring that back or incorporate it in what we, those are the sorts of programs that we would be looking to include in the element to make sure that those issues are addressed. I know with respect to the school impact fees, we're limited in what can be charged, that there are, both nexus study requirements and then statutory limits on how much the city, or sorry, how much the district collects in impact fees. So, but certainly that kind of analysis and that kind of work would happen when development projects are proposed as part of any future application.
I can just add that, all development, all residential development, when an application receives a building permit, they're obligated to pay a school impact fee. So, whether you're talking about one or 100, they're all the units are subject to an impact fee.
I see. Okay, great. And then my last question was about expediting housing development. And, this question also sort of reaches into the need to integrate the historically white communities that are zoned for single family homes. And I'm just curious if someone may be able to address the concept of having an overlay to expedite affordable housing development in the single family home neighborhoods.
It's an interesting concept if it's aimed at single family homes. Usually what you would have is an affordable housing overlay that was on sites where you would be building multifamily, because the economics would not favor building to accommodate. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, but it would be an overlay that would facilitate multifamily homes, like affordable homes in the single family home neighborhoods, like with infill opportunities and whatnot to expedite permitting and things like that.
Yeah, I think it depends on how you're defining multifamily, because I'm thinking of it as you know, traditional affordable, where you get your affordability is in projects that are scaled at a certain size that might not fit in a multifamily neighborhood easily. And you could maybe do duplexes and triplexes and those kinds of units in that setting. But building like a 50 unit multifamily affordable development, you're typically not going to look in a single family neighborhood. So yeah, I mean, I think there is a place for affordable housing overlay zones, but it would probably be more where we would already be looking at multifamily as permitted use and incentivizing it or encouraging it and saying, you know, if you build affordable, you get another floor or you get additional height or less parking or something more like that, and not so much. I think there may need to be other strategies for the single family neighborhoods.
And there are, you know, some guidance on what to look for in terms of defining possible affordable housing sites. You know, you're looking at density and size of lot. We wouldn't generally try to identify a smaller lot for an affordable housing site, because really what you need is, I think there's a minimum, Barry, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 20 units per acre or 20 units per acre.
Yeah, in Marin County it is. It's usually 30 units per acre in most cities the size of San Rafael. I think there's an exception here, but it's, yeah, typically 30.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Okay, great. Well, I think that was a really good discussion. Do any commissioners have any more questions? Otherwise, we'll open it up to the public. No? Okay, great. Leslie, could you call for public comment?
Yes, I see one member attendee, but I don't actually see a name or number. But if you are there and wish to speak, you can raise the hand, use the raise the hand icon found at the bottom of the screen, and or if you're phoning in, dial *9. And I actually want to ask anyone else if they can see who the attendee is.
Yes, I see a name there.
How interesting. Okay. Are they raising their hand? I don't know why my screen is blank here. Okay, otherwise I'd have to make you host. Okay, let's give that attendee one. They feel the pressure since they're the only one. No hand raised, Barry?
No hand.
Okay, how strange. I just see blank. Okay, no one wishes to speak.
Okay, great. Well, with that, we'll close the public hearing. And are there any additional questions that the commissioners have? I presume not, based on the fact there was no public comment. Okay. Okay, great. Well, with that, we will end this section. And thank you very much, Barry.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Excellent. And next, we'll move into the director's report.
I am actually gonna, oh, she left me. I have nothing for the director's report. So I'm wondering if the director has anything to add for the director's report.
I'll just go ahead and add some things that have been happening. I believe that you are all aware that we have been exploring the district boundaries. We are required to do that at every time of the census, and it's that time of the, to reevaluate. So we're doing that. We just did the redistricting or the district boundaries a couple of years ago, but because it's a new census that's now available, we're having to do that again. So that's happening at the city council level. And we, as you know, have a vacancy in the planning commission. So we are going to be looking at getting that filled here soon. Anybody out there that you know of that would be interested and would make a great commissioner, please do invite them and encourage them to apply. Coming up at the city council, we have a number of things. We released a notice of funding availability for affordable housing, something that Samina, Commissioner Sabi, you were talking about. It is intended for affordable housing projects. We received a number of applications. We plan on having a recommendation to the City Council on March 7th. So that is coming up. We also have, every year, we have our annual progress report that we are required to report out on. Alexis has been spending some time gathering information for that report out. And what will happen is we provide the information to the City Council first at a public hearing and then deliver it to the state on by April 1st. So that's coming to the City Council soon. Trying to remember what else is coming to the City Council. We did have some items that just went to the Design Review Board. Leslie, I don't know if any of those are coming to the Planning Commission for consideration.
Not in the near future, no. But the second reading of the Los Galmos project, which you did see, is going, it was approved by City Council 1.5 weeks ago, and is going for the second reading on the 22nd. So that's super exciting.
And I just want to mention that our attendee happens to be the applicant of the Los Galmos project. So he's listening in and is probably smiling right now. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Ali. All right. Do any commissioners have any additional comments they would like to communicate?
Commissioner Harris, and I just want to say, Barry, I really appreciate what you shared. I learned quite a bit, and it was very informative, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Commissioner Harris. All right. Well, seeing no additional comments, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice evening.